so go ahead and set up in your, and I have the private repo open. And at the same level you created week 2, create week 3, and then create your index file, your main.js file. And as we've done before, include the script file telling the source that your JavaScript file is main.js. Okay. Before we start today, I just want to say a word about quotes, single or double. So like if we did const, because we know unless you need to redeclare something, we should use most of the time when we want a variable const my name equals, right? Here I could do either a single quote or I could do a double quote. So, and inside of those quotes would be some numeric or alphanumeric data, right? So I could put, right, is, I'm not, by the way, I just like 42, right? So now I have both numeric, oh, I have 3 L's in there, alphanumeric data, right? So I have letters, characters, and numbers. So but the key to this is it's a string that I'm storing this string in this variable, right? And then when I want to use that string, maybe somewhere, right? Then I would want to, maybe I want to strip out all the spaces. Maybe I want to add a year to the age. Well, that would be harder to do in this kind of way I've written it. But that's not the point of the discussion. The point of the discussion, and I wanted to go and actually ask chat about this, like when you're learning JavaScript, should we use single or double quotes? And it's like both are valid, interchangeable in most cases, right? It's generally a matter of personal preference. I've noticed when I write JavaScript, I like to use single quotes, but I've noticed in my setup using the Prettier extension, it really likes me to use double quotes. So I've kind of just conformed to that. But, you can do it either way. Also the importance of ending with a semicolon that we talked about last week. Okay? Now comes the difference, and we can do this. Let's clean this up a little bit. Actually, just store the name here, right? And then const my age, again, is not, right? Okay, so now I have set up 2 variables. Those variables I have assigned values of a string value and a number value. All right, so those are the variables I've set up to use in my code, but the way JavaScript actually handles storing these in the computer set, in the computer's lower level, the programming language, is something called primitives. Okay. And primitives, and we can look at primitives in introducing a new command called type of. So if I say type of my age, right? Well, I can see it's a number here, right? So I would think, and I'm going to move over to my output in DevTools, and this is actually what it shows me here. Now, kind of cool, by the way, in DevTools, is you can also see what line that was on, and that's a really good thing to start to understand as well. But I want to show you something. Let's say, and this is something you're going to do throughout this course, if I set a breakpoint on line 1, and that's what I'm doing by clicking just to the other side, just click around, but now click onto line 1 and hit refresh. And what this does is it stops the execution of the JavaScript file, the code. So right now this line is about to run, and I have these nice little icons over here, okay, that I can actually tell it, hey, now execute this line. But if I was to come down here because this line hasn't executed and I type my age, right, it'd be like, no, it's uncaught. There's nothing, there can't access it because this line has not executed. So if I execute that line, now I'm going to use up my up arrow. Now I can see what that line did. It actually executed that line. It stored that string value into that variable, and I can see that output here. Okay? And so if I do the next one, right? Now, and by the way, I could do the same thing, my age. Now I can see that's here. But what I can ask now I can run a line, a JavaScript command, a statement. It actually shows me the type of my age, right? And that's because because JavaScript is dynamically typed, right? I could store anything in there. Like I could come back over here, right? And I could do that. So what would that change? Now what would my age be, right? Well, actually, let's take off the breakpoint. And what happens here, by the way, and this is good to learn about with DevTools, is it's still suspended right here. It's actually waiting, and it has to kind of do its cleanup work, right? It has to finish. So what you can do is either refresh the page or just hit this little play button, and then it plays. And then in a second, it's going to refresh, but I'm going to go ahead and make it refresh. And so now what it says is my age is actually a string, because what I assign a variable is in my choice, right? But JavaScript evaluates that and says, you know what? That's actually a string. Even though for me, if I look at it, it still has quotes around it, but I might think that's a numeric value. Now, where this gets kind of weird with JavaScript, and this is kind of why people get upset with JavaScript sometimes. So last week, and this kind of introduces the idea of operators. If I did, there's a couple things. Let's do const, right? JS is weird is going to be equal to my name plus my age. Now, before we run any code, just think to yourself, what do I think is going to be stored here? Because now I have two different data types, right? I have a string data type here. I have a numeric data type here. And now when I add these together, right, I'm going to store the result in is weird. And here I'm going to say, hey, what data type is weird? And let's go ahead and do this. Let's do console.log and actually output what it is. Okay. Okay. So at this point, again, I want you to kind of think about this before, or if you've already looked at it, but also give yourself a moment to kind of look at that and kind of guess what it's going to do, because part of what you're learning is just how JavaScript thinks. Believe it or not, that's what you're learning. So let's go over here, right? So when we got to line 6, right, and after it had added these together, notice what it did. It took the numeric value of 42. It took the string value of Rio Waller. And when you added them together, it actually looks like it just, crunched it together. The word for that is concatenated it together. Because what it did is it actually converted, in the sense that when it saw the add here, it says, oh, you want to actually do string concatenation. In other words, make this two strings that I'm going to put together. But I'm like, no, that's actually not, or why would I ever want to add these things together? But in JavaScript, because you can store anything in here, this is why people who are, again, strongly typed programming folks think JavaScript is so crazy, because you can do something like this. Now, there's also power in being able to do this. Don't get wrong. Don't think that there's not also an upside to being able to do something like this that may seem kind of weird. Okay. All right. So just a moment here too, and I wanted to talk about just the math concept, because last week we ended with the carbon footprint, and we added together values, and that actually added them, right? So it took the value and added them. They were all numeric, so we didn't have this weirdness go on, but it really did, and we didn't spend any time talking about it, so I wanted to here, is talking about the idea of math in JavaScript, right? Math, numbers, and operators. Because in JavaScript, and this kind of gets to what I was talking about before a little bit, because, in programming, we have integers, whole numbers, right? It can be negatives, We have floating points, which are decimals. We have doubles. But all three of these types are all still numbers. And that's what this talks about, is that it doesn't matter what these are, right? So if I was to come over here and I was to type 42 point, whatever, right? Still, when I ask it the data type, oh, actually didn't have it here. Okay, so I could actually, again, this is where having DevTools open is so beneficial. So I could just type my age, right? Oh, sorry. It'll show me, but I could also just say type of my age, right? I'm wondering why it put the, yeah, I'm wondering why it put that there, because now I have to know. But because that actually didn't quite make sense to me, because if I did here, if I console.log type of my age, it would do number. Yeah, that's something I get to go play with. Now it still did concatenate them together on line 6. It did give me is weird is a string, and it did give me that it was a number. Must just be the way the console. But that's one of those things. That's one of those things when you're programming, you kind of go, why did that look a little different? Okay. All right. So when we're looking, let's go back here, right? So it's all a number, right? And it gives you some examples, like it's kind of something we kind of just did with the age concept. And here's the type of. And there are definitely what we call methods. Now, methods are something we haven't gotten to, but it's we can call a method on a data value, and in this case for numbers, but we'll see methods all over the place. So we could say lots of decimals, right? And then we could say a to-fix method to only have 2 decimal places. That's kind of cool. But really what I want to do is scroll on down, and good to evaluate some of these things. But here are the operators for JavaScript. Okay, so we have the plus, we have the minus, we have the multiplication, division, and these are two. Now, exponent is generally one that people have heard of, like 5 to the second, to the power of 2, right? It turns 25. But modulo is often something people who are new to programming have, like, they look at that and they're like, what does this mean? They think this is percentage, but it's in programming languages, but specifically in JavaScript, it says when you're dividing, like, it returns the remainder of the division, not the whole integer part of it. And there's oftentimes in programming we want to be able to do that. So know what those operators are, because you may run into them. We'll definitely run into them when programming. And I'll end this before we move on to talking about primitives a little more, to say the other thing about when you're writing a little more involved statements that affect that are involved in numbers, whether those be variables or just the actual values itself. Remember, just like in math, there's something called operator precedence, right? So operator precedence, and this actually, I think in this article or somewhere I'll give you, a link to actually telling you there's actually a number associated with. I guess it's not here. Yeah, we're going to look at those in a minute. So basically it says when you're doing multiplication, just like again in regular math, and if you have a line, sorry, let me go back, right? So it's going to prioritize, right? Calculating the result. Yeah, multiplication and division are always done first. This is true in JavaScript as it is in regular math, and then add and subtract. But you can, and this is key, is you can overwrite that by using the parentheses. Okay, so in your, matter of fact, here, right? So let's just do our first. What is order of, right? Right. So answer that question. I have to spell it right. That would be good, right? So it's just like regular math. Right, the multiplication and division are prioritized, and then comes these, but you can overwrite it, right? So put that in your own words, right? So that's what I want to see here. And then what I want to do is I want to have you write an example, right? Come up with some calculation or some formula or something here that shows that, you know, you not only spend a moment to look at it, but you could actually write a JavaScript statement to show that, right? So you could do something like const result, right, equals, right? Now, don't use the example, come up with your own just to play around here, and then do console.log, right, result. And you can even do, we're using numbers here, so we don't have to do type of. Okay, so that is really the first two that I wanted to talk about, was the single quotes, double quotes, the idea of math and the operators. And we will come back to operators, because one thing we do need to talk about, and we will, is the idea of also doing plus equal, minus equal, and actually the other one that's really important is the comparison operators, right? Because what we've been doing all this time is doing an assign, but you in JavaScript, and this can throw people off, and I know when I first saw it, it did me as well. You have a triple equals, right? You have so this is strictly equal, right? So anyway, we'll come back to this, because I think this needs a little more time, and I want to finish up this section, really talking about primitives, because we started talking about them before. Right? But I kind of got to the idea of we set up a variable, the computer stores it as its primitive value, and I just briefly looked at them. But the ones we haven't talked about is Boolean, undefined, and null. Because like I said, these are the other ones, typically you don't see them until you've done a little more advanced programming, but you're welcome to look at them. Right? So let's actually look at, first we've looked at, let's look at Boolean. Boolean is really cool, okay? Because what it says, and let's say, is, well, actually, I'm not going to do that. Am I hungry equals, right, true, right? So it's true. Now, we're going to use these Booleans because it could also be equal to false. Right? Now what I'm doing here is very much the same as what I'm doing up here, where I'm setting this as a Boolean value. Now you'll see how we can use Boolean value with something called logic that we'll see very soon. But again, you could type console.log type of, right, I am hungry. And if we come over here, oh, I'm going to comment those out. Right? And it is a Boolean type, so true or false. This is very, very common. Any programming language you'll be introduced to will have a Boolean, and they will be true or false, and then you can write code to say if something is true. Now there's multiple ways we're going to end up doing this, right? But this is a primitive value, right? So even if it's false, even if it's true, it's still a Boolean. It's just that for something to be Boolean, it is either true or false. There's two values. It's on or off. It's true or false. It's not like these other variables where we can store varying values in there, but these two vary true or false. Okay? Again, we'll see those a lot in this class, so we'll come back to them. Let's go back here. Now, the other one is undefined. So let's actually look at that one. So if I say const my var, okay, now at this point I haven't done anything else to it, right? And you might wonder, well, why is it giving us an error, right? And because I didn't do that. And that's because if you roll over it, now that your editor might be set up a little differently, but when we're using const, it's like you must declare, you must do it. But let's say this would be an example of using let. So let my var, so all we're doing is setting up the variable, or we're declaring it, we're not assigning it, okay? So if I do console.log type of my var, right? If I come over here and look at it, it is undefined. So this is a data type that says in the computer you have declared this value, but you have not assigned anything to it, so it is undefined, which is just a lot of words to say basically I see the variable declaration but I don't see an assignment to it, so I'm going to call it undefined. The reason you want to know this, it is very common when you're programming to see the undefined. Okay, and we have actually already seen the last one that we'll talk about, at least with primitives here, which is the null. Do you remember seeing the null? The null we saw, and if you click on here, you will see, and null is it's basically saying the reference. Do you have a reference to something that is intentionally represents a reference point to a non-existent object? And do you remember when we saw it was here in week 2 under main, when I was showing you about this returning the document query selector if the H1 did not exist. So like right now, if I was to just copy this line, and now I'm in week 2 and I'm just going to copy that line. Oh, I am so, you know what? I think I'm going to have my editor, because I'm so bad sometimes about doing the semicolons. So if I did this, if I set up a const, I did a H1, in my document I don't have an H1, then if I said, right, if I then did a console.log and I said type of my heading, and come back over here, right, I would have expected that to be interesting. So this is where, oh yeah, it's null. Oh yeah, so even, oh, very good, right? So the reference itself is null, but when we assign it into a variable like this, then it sets up an object that we can then we can do other things too. Yeah, that is one of the things about JavaScript that can kind of, and it's true about programming languages in general, right? So just this, when we're running this, the result is null, but because we're declaring it, it goes ahead and sets it up as an object. Because here, and this is a really good thing to end on, and we come back to here, right? Let's go back to, right? These are the primitive values, but also what happens is everything in JavaScript becomes, anything that's not a primitive value is generally an object. Okay, and that's something as we move forward you'll learn more about. So, and we just did a little bit, because when we were assigning that null value, it actually made it an object. So sorry if that was confusing, but you know, sometimes when you're doing things, oh, I must just be in there. Okay, so at this point, what you want to do is we're going to go ahead and version control the work that you've done. Git add star. I don't know, I have to do this with you, because I'm guessing at this point you have it. And then that space shouldn't be there. What you want to have is a commit message with quotes, operators, and primitives. Okay. All right. We'll have a second video for this one, so look for that one next.